Kay Milifalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. And today is May 12th, and it's a very special day. Today is the birthday of the inestimable, I couldn't think of the word, Florence Nightingale. So happy birthday, Florence. And I thought we'd take a little look at her life. This is somebody I've known about since I was a little kid. I had a book about famous people. I remember this book so well. Famous people who led the way. And it had people like Louis Pasteur and Galen and Hippocrates and Florence Nightingale. And I always was fascinated with her, but I don't know much about her. I know a bit more now because I've been reading. Okay, Florence Nightingale, born May 12th, 1820, into an enormously wealthy family. And she was born in the Via Columbia in Florence, Italy. She was named after her place of birth, as was her older sister, who was born in Greece and was named Frances Parthenope, after the Parthenon, I guess. So they returned to England when Florence was a year old, and she grew up in the family homes, plural, in Embley, Hampshire, and Lea Hurst, Derbyshire. Her family was unusual. Her parents were liberal humanitarians in their outlook. Her father was William David Shore. Her mother was Frances Smith. When they got married, after they got married, they eventually took the name Nightingale. William's great uncle, Peter Nightingale, died and left him the estate on the demand that he change his last name. So they all became Nightingales. And this is the estate at Lea Hurst that he inherited. Frances, Florence's mom, her father was William Smith, who was a Unitarian abolitionist and well known for his position. Florence's father, William, had very advanced ideas about women's education. Upper crust English women didn't really get educated. They might have a governess and learn how to embroider, but that was about it. She studied history, math, Italian, classic literature, and philosophy. She had a gift for collecting and analyzing data, which served her well later in her life. In 1838, so what was she? 8 years old? No, 18. The family went on a tour of Europe, and she met a woman in Paris named Mary Clark that she eventually grew very fond of and called her Clarky. Clarky was a hostess. She would have salons, and people would come and just socialize. That were unusual because she did not care about her appearance. She was never boring. She's described as exasperating and eccentric. She had no respect for upper-class British women. She felt they were inconsequential. Given the choice, she said, between being a woman and a galley slave, she'd choose to be a galley slave. She actually rejected female company and spent all of her time with intellectual type men. But she made an exception for the Nightingales. She really liked the whole family, especially Florence. And although they were 27 years apart in age, they became close friends and remained pretty much best friends for 40 years. She showed Florence that women could be equal to men, and Florence did not learn this from her own mother. Florence was interesting. I never knew this. She had kind of a spiritual bent. And she believed that she had had several calls from God. Now, we're not talking church. We're talking spiritual, philosophical. February of 1837, while still at Emberley Park, she experienced what she called a strong desire to devote her life to the service of others. As a young girl, she wanted to be a nurse, and she respected her family's disapproval and disagreement with it until 1844, she was in her early 20s. Her mother and her sister were extremely angry and distressed because she rejected every attempt to get her married off to assume the role of wife and mother. She went on independent studies. She educated herself in the art and science of nursing, despite the opposition of her family and the restrictive social code for affluent young English women at the time. She was described as attractive, slender, graceful, charming, with a severe demeanor, but a radiant smile. She had a persistent suitor, a poet politician named Richard Monckton Milnes, and he courted her for 9 years. She finally just put a stop to it because she felt marriage would interfere with her ability to be a nurse. In 1847 in Rome, she met a guy on his honeymoon, Sidney Herbert, who had been the former Secretary of War. They became lifelong close friends. I just have this funny little feeling she was about 2 weeks too late. They were just at the beginning of their honeymoon. Bad timing. He became the Secretary of War. They were friends. She got help from him and from his wife because he eventually became the Secretary of War again, and he had pull, and he and his wife were able to help her to become a nurse in Crimea, like get her passes and visas and kind of smooth the way for her to go to the Crimea. She was his key advisor in his political career. Some say that his death was hastened from Bright's disease. He died of it in 1861 because of the pressure of her reform program. She was relentless, and the pressure made him succumb sooner. A lot of things were said about her. She was a meddling woman, you know. She later had a strong relationship with Benjamin Jonnet, who was an academic, and he wanted to marry her, people think. Excuse me. She traveled to Egypt and she traveled to Greece, and in Athens, she rescued a little owl the children were torturing, and she took care of it. It became her pet until right before she went to Crimea, it died. She kept a journal in Egypt. She sailed up the Nile to Abu Simbel and went into Thebes, where she felt she had a call from God. Again in Cairo, this is a quote, "God called me in the morning and asked me, would I do good for him alone without reputation?" No ego. This is actually the second time I started this video because I had intended to show you a book. I forgot to bring it upstairs. Then I had to go downstairs and figure out where I put it. Was with my history books, but I found it with my Egypt books. I have Florence Nightingale's Letters from Egypt. It's really interesting, and it's actually really beautiful. Let me show you. There are a lot of black and white photos. But there was one picture in here that was just so gorgeous. Of course, now can't find it, but I will. Well, if this is an example of the pictures in this book, they're just beautiful. I can't really see if you can see them or not. There. Let's see, there's another one that's really stunning. Very interesting book, and to hear what she went through, the kinds of lives that she saw of people. Really, really interesting. Well, darn it, you know, it was the first picture I opened the book to when I first looked at the book, and now, of course, I can't find it, but here's a good one. just to have some unusual books. I belonged to a weird history book club, and you just never know what you're going to get. I think a lot of them were remainders or odd lots or whatever. And so a lot of the things in the catalog, this is in the day when you got a paper catalog, they, you never knew what you were going to get. And I think that's where I got this book. Okay, so that's show and tell. She kept this journal in Egypt, and God called her several times and told her to do good work, but without an advantage to her reputation. In 1850, she visited a Lutheran religious community called Kaiserwerth am Rhein in Germany. She met with the pastor and the deaconesses who were doing nursing for the sick and the deprived, and this became a big turning point in her life. In 1851, she wrote about it, but she wrote anonymously. It was her first public work. I imagine as an aristocratic young woman, she probably was dissuaded from putting her real name on it. So she made it her business to get 4 months of medical training. On August 22nd, 1853, she took the post of supervisor at the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen on Upper Harley Street. She did that for over a year until October of 1854. She had an annual income from her father, because she was wealthy. She got 500 pounds a year, which translated into today's dollars would be $65,000 a year, on which she could live very comfortably. She heard reports of horrific conditions in the Asian side of the Bosporus, opposite Constantinople. This is where the fighting was going on. England and France had entered the war on the side of the Ottoman Empire, and I had to look that up twice. I thought I'm not reading this correctly, but they were on the side of the Ottoman Empire and fighting all of them against the Russians. On October 21st, 1854, she and 38 volunteers, including head nurse Eliza Roberts and Florence's Aunt May Smith, this would be her mother's sister, and 15 Catholic nuns, went to Crimea. They got help on the way from Mary Clarksey in Paris. They set up their work 295 nautical miles from the British camp across the Black Sea at Balaclava, Crimea. And they actually took them a month. They arrived there in November. They got there to find deplorable conditions, an extremely overworked staff with very poor care, if any at all, official indifference, medicines in short supply, no provisions for any kind of hygiene, mass infections, many of them fatal, overcrowding, no way to prepare food for the patients. So she sent a plea to the Times, to the newspaper, begging the government, but she sent it to the Times. Very clever PR, and shamed the government. And the British commissioned a guy. Now, this is this guy's name. I had to look this up too. I couldn't believe it. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. I thought, were they talking about the Sultan of Brunei or something? I couldn't figure it out. But he was an English civil engineer, and he was ordered to design a prefab hospital, which was very unusual. It was built in England and shipped in pieces to the Dardanelles, where it was put together as the Renkioi Hospital under the management of Edward Alexander Parkes. By the time they got this set up with Florence Nightingale in charge, the death rate there became 1/10 of the rate of death at the Sartari barracks across the water where the English were. She reduced the death rate from 42% death rate to 2%, purely by improving hygiene, hand washing. The first winter, 4,077 men had died, most of them from communicable illnesses, typhus, typhoid, cholera, dysentery. There was overcrowding. Oh, defective sewers. I thought that said defective servers. And I thought, what? Slow waiters? What did they, that killed them? No, defective sewers. Lack of ventilation. You can only imagine. I have read before the conditions were horrendous. So after 6 months, she got the government to send out what became the Sanitary Commission. They flushed all the sewers, they improved ventilation, and the death rates plummeted. May of 1855, she survived a very critical illness with the help of Eliza Roberts. And they were trying to do all kinds of praising of her publicly for the work and the lower death rate. She would not let them talk about it. In modern times, there were unsubstantiated criticisms of her. The BBC made a couple of documentaries in 2001, I think, in 2008, and they were very critical of her, but historians who have studied the first primary source materials, letters and diaries and such, people who knew her really well, they said, no, this is a smear job because she was a strong woman in a time when women were not allowed to be strong women, that she was anything but a horrible person. She was wonderful. And, you know, she may not have been coy and cutesy and feminine, but she got the job done. It was considered preposterous, these slurs. She still thought that the death rate was too high, and it was from poor nutrition and a lack of supplies, stale air, and soldiers who were overworked to begin with, so their resistance was down. She returned to England later and collected data and showed that there were far too many deaths that happened from poor living conditions, and it really affected the whole way that the English military worked. She taught her advocacy of sanitary conditions and stressed how important this was. She was able to reduce peacetime deaths in the Army dramatically, and she began to improve civilian hospitals. So she was sort of spreading the gospel of hygiene. Over here, by the way, Klimt, the goddess Hygeia, patron saint of health. Well, goddess of health. And she also spread her influence over working class districts' homes. She had a very frosty relationship with a fellow nurse named Mary Seacole. And there were remarks, you know, in some of this primary source material, and I couldn't understand what they were hinting at until I saw a picture of Mary Seacole. She was Black. I don't know if she was American or English, but there were hints of sort of a classist racism going on. But as it turns out, they found writings of Florence Nightingale about this woman, and she did not like her. This woman ran a business, a hotel/hospital, and it was only for officers. And Florence said, oh, well, she has a great job. She keeps them all drunk, that there was an enormous amount of alcohol consumed on premises, and she didn't approve of that. There were two waves of Irish nuns that helped her. The first were the Sisters of Mercy, and from that group is where she made that lifelong friend. But they were more than happy to let her take charge. She had the authority because she was familiar with the situation. The second group were led by Mary Frances Bridgman, and she did not want to be bossed around by this twit. And so, and you know, and I imagine English, upper crust, Irish, you know, I'm sure that became an issue too. She became known as the lady with the lamp. She would make solitary rounds every night. She got very little sleep. She was one of these people who needed very little sleep. And she would wander the halls at night, checking individually on each soldier in his bed. And she'd carry a small lamp to guide her path. And this was popularized by a poem by Longfellow called Santa Filomena. She's also called the lady with the hammer by the soldiers, because she once broke into a locked medicine cabinet to get medicine for the wounded, and they were all very impressed with a hammer. In Crimea, November 29th, 1855, there was created a thing called the Nightingale Fund to train nurses for the front lines, and it received generous donations. She wrote to people in Europe after the war and tried to describe Crimean spas and the amenities and said, these are every bit as nice, if not better, than the fancy places you guys go in Switzerland, and they cost far less. And her goal was to help a recovering economy in the area. She set up the first nursing school, the Nightingale Training School at St. Thomas Hospital, July 9th, 1860. The first trained nurses to graduate began work the 16th of May, 1865, so it was a 5-year course. And they started out at the Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary. It's now part of King's College, London, with the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing and Midwifery. So very exciting. It's incredible that she has continued this whole time. In 1866, she called the Royal Buckinghamshire Hospital in Aylesbury the most beautiful hospital in England. In 1859, she wrote a book called Notes on Nursing, and it became the cornerstone of nursing school curricula. And specifically, though, it was for nursing care at home, as most people did their being sick and dying at home. But it's considered the first classic introduction to nursing. She spent her life promoting and organizing nursing. The book is considered to be written by the founder of modern nursing. It was a significant achievement to put nurses in the workhouses because those poor people had no one to take care of them. They were considered paupers and less than, nobody cared. And finally, for the first time, they were being cared for by trained professionals. In the first half of the 1800s, nurses were not professional. They were stray women who had no other way to make money. They were the servants that couldn't find a job because they were, the term is slattern, or they were widows who had no skills and they couldn't find a job, but they were forced to work. And so they're beautifully characterized by who other than Charles Dickens in the 1843-1844 novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, in the character of Sarah Gamp, who was drunk, incompetent, and corrupt. That was like the first famous nurse in modern literature. Hospitals were places of last resort. I remember being horrified when I read this book as a kid. When they described hospitals, I couldn't believe it. I had no idea. They had straw on the floor to soak up the blood. There was no understanding of the germ theory. They don't mention it in this information about Florence Nightingale, but something that really stuck in my head were the black frock coats of the surgeons. So the surgeons would do surgery in a theater. They still call it the operating theater in England. And it really was a theater. It was a room that, you had half circles of benches and they went all the way up, kind of like an arena or something, and everyone would look down while you did the surgery. And there was no sterile technique. There were often no anesthesia except maybe ether. And the surgeons wore these black frock coats, the kind that had the tails, and they wore the same coat every time they did surgery. It was not to keep anything clean, or the purpose was, it was like a symbol of office, a uniform of office. And they'd put these things on, and they're described as being stiff with blood and body fluids, and you can imagine. And so people died right and left from surgery because of the infection. Of course, they didn't wash their hands. They would go from doing an autopsy or surgery like this straight to the side of a woman in labor, and she'd die a week later of puerperal fever because she'd get infected. Pretty grim. Anyway, I got off the track. That's a little history for everybody. That's no longer true, YouTube. That's history. It's from couple hundred years ago. So the hospitals were terrible places, and the descriptions of them from the 1850s are things of nightmare. She transformed nursing. She had lots of prominent people who were her connections, and she wasn't afraid to use them. She was stubborn, opinionated, and forthright, and she did believe in the germ theory of infection, and she did not believe in its predecessor. Now, I want to make this clear. This is not my belief. This is a completely false, old belief before people understood what germs were. This is the history of that sort of thing. It's called the contagionism, and they believed that disease could only be transmitted by touch, but obviously now we know much better that airborne and other forms of transmission. But in those days, that was something that was believed, and she thought that was utterly ridiculous. She advocated for the work of Pasteur and Lister. She was an inspiration for the American Civil War nurses. They fashioned themselves after her. The Union asked her advice, and she inspired the voluntary U.S. Sanitary Commission during the war. She advocated autonomy for nurses, which was quite a struggle because doctors did not like to be challenged by women, and often the women knew far more than the doctors did. It's all very gendered too, by the way. In 1870, she mentored Linda Richards, who became America's first trained nurse. She became a pioneer in American nursing and in Japanese nursing. Bellevue Training School for Nurses in 1873 was started by Elizabeth Christophers Hobson, and she also used Florence Nightingale's approach. Her nurses became the matrons of many leading hospitals around England and into the United States and the world. In 1883, she became the first recipient of the Royal Red Cross. She got a number of awards, and I kind of glossed over a lot of them. She was the first woman to get the Order of Merit, whatever that is. Her birthday is considered International May 12th Awareness Day to bring attention to such immunological and neurological diseases as, oh God, what was it? I forgot to write them down, but you can imagine. She contracted brucellosis. That's not something you hear a lot about, but you're going to hear more about it. I'm going to make that prediction right now, because where does it come from? Unpasteurized milk. Who's a big fan of that? Anyway, brucellosis is a zoonosis. It's an infection that jumps from animals to humans, and the pathogen is a bacteria that causes a chronic disease. It's also known as undulant fever or Malta fever or Mediterranean fever. And as I said, it comes from unpasteurized milk, among a number of other things. You can get tuberculosis. Also, I've been reading a book on tuberculosis, and I didn't know that. That's kind of scary. It causes other chronic disorders. It's an infection, and it's the kind of infection. I didn't write down the term because but it's the kind of infection that just sort of hangs around and is always causing you problems. And in her, she got spondylitis, which is an inflammation of the vertebra, which is very painful. She was often bedridden and depressed from 1857 on. From her bed, she did pioneering work in hospital planning, but eventually lost her eyesight and had declining mental abilities from the brucellosis. But she was a pioneer woman, but she thought that women were, in general, cravers of sympathy and not as capable as men. She had opinions. She thought that women's rights activists said that, well, look at them. They claim there are no careers for women, but there are all these medical careers going unfilled. Kind of a narrow approach to the topic, because not everybody wants to be a nurse in Crimea. She preferred the company of powerful men. I bet she did. She called herself a man of action or a man of business. She did have a couple of very important female friends, that Irish nun, Mary Clare Moore, from the Sisters of Mercy, who worked with her in Crimea, Mary Clark from Paris, and wait till you hear this. This surprised me. She was extremely close friends with Ada Lovelace, the pioneering computer programmer. Who knew? And Ada died at the age of 36 from cancer and really crushed Florence. They were really good friends. Some say, this is interesting, that she had a religious calling to chastity because she sort of lived like, like a very aesthetic life, like a mendicant nun or something, like one of those nuns who go into a cloister, except she worked out in the public. But she just was completely divorced from the whole world of sexual politics based on male-female relationships. Anything else about her? I don't know. I wonder, but who cares? Look at what she did. Seems a little unfair to speculate about things. She did have very, very strong female friendships. And I think that says something about her, because it wasn't, she made awfully harsh comments about women, but she wasn't incapable of forming close relationships. So I think at heart, she was a good person. At heart, she was capable of having friendships. She died in her sleep at the Mayfair, London residence she was staying on 13th of August, 1910. She was 90 years old. Her family was offered to bury her at Westminster Abbey, but they said no, and they buried her at St. Margaret's at East Wellow near Embley Park, their home. A monument to her was erected in 1913 at the Basilica Santa Croce in Florence. She did pioneering work in nursing. However, a lot of people don't know this about her. Remember, I mentioned she was very good at collecting and analyzing data. She designed all sorts of statistical tools that are still used today. And if she didn't design them, she found them in their obscurity and made them a thing. She was very into statistical graphics. She popularized the use of pie chart and the polar area diagram, also known as the Nightingale rose diagram. And it's used to track the occurrence of diseases. It's this weird circular kind of a pie chart, but there are all these things coming out of it. It's weird looking. She was the member of the Royal Statistical Society and the American Statistical Society. Here's a little bit of information. Her cousin was named Hilary Bonham Carter, who eventually has a descendant named Helena Bonham Carter, the English actress. She made big contributions to public health in India after Crimea. So, a lot of similar stuff she did in one place, she did in another. She was also known for writing. She wrote over 200 things, publications, including books, pamphlets, papers. She wrote on feminism, and interestingly enough, she wrote on religious philosophy. She believed, and she advocated this quite vocally, and she lived it. She believed that real religion was the act of care and giving of love to other people. She was very much a student of paganism and Eastern thought. She strongly was opposed to religious discrimination. She didn't like the my Baptist church is better than your Episcopalian church kind of nonsense. She thought none of that mattered. What mattered was how you treated people. She didn't believe in salvation because she felt that we were all part of God and we're going back there, and it was nonsense to worry about that. She believed that the Church of England actually had worsened the oppression of the poor by being judgmental and punitive. She thought secular hospitals were better than religious hospitals because what they cared about was the benefit and welfare of the patients, whereas religious health workers often went into it concerned about their own salvation. Secondary were the patients. She dedicated her life to her professional desire to deliver the best care for all. And that is the great, great Florence Nightingale. I hope you enjoyed that. It was fun to read about her, and she was a remarkable person. Really interesting. And who knew she knew Ada Lovelace? That's just okay. Thank you very much, and happy birthday. Everybody have a piece of cake for Florence. Slán go fóill. Slán.